He came to say goodbye to his mother, but saw his ex-wife and 2 boys with his eyes. What she's been hiding for 8 years will turn everything upside down. Subscribe and write in the comments from where you're watching this video. A cold wind swept through the cemetery grounds in Buckhead, one of Atlanta's oldest and most affluent neighborhoods, stirring the black coats and veils of the mourners gathered beneath a leaden sky. Thick clouds hung low like a sagging ceiling, pressing down with the weight of silent grief. The leaves of ancient oaks rustled faintly above, as if murmuring their own farewell to the woman laid out in the casket draped with lilies, Eleanor Bryant, matriarch, business magnate, and, to some, an icon, to others, a shadow. Nicholas Bryant stood among the crowd, tall and composed in a sharply cut black suit. 34 years old, and already a name in the architectural circles of New York and Chicago, he had returned to his childhood city for this solemn day, the funeral of the woman who had shaped him more than he had ever admitted. The world had seen Eleanor as a pillar of Southern legacy, a woman whose life was embroidered with philanthropy, taste, and perfection. But Nicholas knew a different version, a colder, sharper figure, molded from steel and expectations. He had arrived 2 nights ago, flying in on a red-eye, sleeping little. The manor on West Pace's Ferry Road had been just as he remembered it, immaculate, stern, quiet without her. He hadn't slept in the house since college. Now her presence loomed larger in death than it had in life. The velvet-draped halls, the crystal chandeliers, the exact arrangement of china in the dining room cabinet, it all breathed her discipline. As the final notes of the organ drifted away, Nicholas stood beneath a tall black umbrella at the edge of the crowd. He hadn't approached the casket, not yet. He preferred watching from a distance, the way he always had when it came to his mother. The minister spoke of duty and grace, of Eleanor's unwavering dedication to her family and city. Nicholas barely heard him. His eyes wandered. It was then, near the iron gates beyond the chapel lawn, that he saw her. She stood, half hidden by a stone column, dressed modestly in a black wool coat. Her posture was stiff, uncertain, as if she didn't belong. Her head was lowered, but the shape of her cheekbones, the way her hands clutched the strap of her purse, it all hit Nicholas like a ghostly echo. He blinked once, twice. Amara. His heart stuttered. It couldn't be. He hadn't seen her in a decade. The last time she had walked out of his life without a word, taken with her the promises they had whispered late into the night, the plans they'd made in their college dorm, the engagement ring he had chosen himself. And yet, there she was, standing in the shadows of his mother's funeral, her eyes cast downward. Beside her stood 2 small boys. Nicholas's breath caught in his throat. The children, twins by the look of them, no older than 8, clung to either side of her, their hands wrapped around the edges of her coat. One boy had tighter curls, deeper skin like hers. The other, his skin a warm, lighter tone, looked directly at Nicholas with wide, greenish eyes. His eyes. A cold sweat spread across Nicholas's back. The air around him stilled. The mourners' movements, the rustle of coats, even the murmur of the minister faded into a dull hush. He stared, transfixed, his mind trying to wrap itself around the impossible. Were they hers? Were they his? He took a step forward, not noticing the muddy earth soaking through the polished leather of his shoes. He couldn't hear anything but the pounding in his ears. Amara's head lifted as if she sensed him, her gaze locking with his. Her expression faltered, somewhere between dread and resignation. She gripped the children's shoulders tighter and seemed to stiffen. Nicholas stopped. He wasn't sure what to do. A dozen questions clamored in his mind, each louder than the last. Why was she here? Why hadn't he heard from her in 10 years? Who were the boys? The funeral continued. The casket was lowered. Dirt fell like muted thunder. People sniffled, wiped eyes, murmured condolences. But Nicholas stood apart, his eyes locked on Amara and the two boys until, slowly, she turned and began to walk away, her hands guiding the children protectively ahead. He moved to follow her, but a hand on his shoulder stopped him. It was Victor, one of the board members of Bryant Heritage, the family business. "We're about to begin the reading at the house," Victor said in a low voice. "You should be there. They're waiting for you." Nicholas nodded absently but barely heard him. He looked again toward the gate, but Amara and the children had already disappeared beyond the hedges. The drive back to the manor was a blur. The family's black Lincoln moved slowly through the tree-lined streets, but his thoughts were already chasing ghosts. Amara. 2 boys. 8 years. His mother's iron grip. How much of this had she known? He had buried a mother that day, but he had unearthed something else entirely, a mystery that pulled at the very edges of his soul. If those children were his, if Amara had been forced away, then everything he thought he knew about the past was a lie. Back at the manor, he climbed the steps slowly, his body moving by habit. Inside, chandeliers glowed above polished wood floors. Staff bustled about, clearing coats, offering drinks. The house was full of polite whispers and carefully measured grief. Nicholas didn't speak to anyone. He retreated to the upstairs study, closed the heavy doors, and stood in front of the fireplace. The flames licked the logs, casting golden light across his face, but he felt no warmth. He pulled his phone from his pocket. It trembled slightly in his hand. He opened his contacts, paused, then searched. Amara James. Nothing. Of course. He sat in the leather chair beside the fire and lowered his head into his hands. He needed answers, and he would find them. The next morning broke slow and reluctant, with a pearly gray light bleeding across the wide windows of the Bryant estate. Nicholas had not slept. After hours of pacing his childhood bedroom and combing through old boxes in a half-hearted search for something, he didn't even know what, he found himself staring at the ceiling in the dark, the image of Amara's face refusing to leave his mind. Every blink brought back the sight of those boys, their eyes, their skin, the way they clung to her. His mind resisted the conclusion that kept forming, but his heart had already accepted it. He had children. By noon, he had done what once would have seemed unthinkable. He'd asked a former intern-turned-private investigator to locate Amara James within city limits. She hadn't left much of a trail. No credit cards, no known residents in Atlanta, no digital footprint worth mentioning. But the intern came through. A motel in East Point, 30 minutes from the Bryant estate. Cash payment, single room, a woman matching Amara's description, accompanied by 2 young boys. Nicholas was in his car before the address finished sending to his phone. The ride was quiet. No music, no calls. He drove with a fixed jaw and unfocused eyes. It wasn't anger that fueled him. It was something deeper, a hollow ache, a blend of guilt, grief, and a gathering storm of realization. He didn't know what he would say when he saw her. He didn't even know what he wanted to hear. But he had to hear something. Silence was no longer an option. The motel sat just off the main road, tucked between a shuttered diner and an abandoned gas station. Faded signage buzzed overhead, and the parking lot was cracked, weeds pushing through the concrete like stubborn truth. Nicholas parked and climbed out slowly, scanning the numbered doors until he found the one the intern had described. Room 17. For a long moment, he stood in front of it, his knuckles just inches from the wood. His hand shook slightly before he finally knocked. Once, then again. The door opened halfway. Amara. She looked smaller than she had yesterday, or maybe it was the harsh afternoon light washing the color from her face. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and she wore a sweatshirt too big for her frame. Her eyes, those same eyes he used to know better than his own, were wary. "I knew you'd come," she said softly without greeting. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "You left." "No, I was pushed." They stood in silence for a long time, the air between them full of things unsaid. She opened the door wider and stepped aside. Inside, the room was clean but bare. 2 twin beds were pushed together. A stack of children's books rested on the nightstand. On the far side of the room, sitting cross-legged with a coloring book, were the twins. One looked up. Elijah, he would learn later, and gave Nicholas a curious glance. The other, Jalen, stayed focused on his crayons. "They don't know who you are," Amara said, her voice flat. "I never told them." He didn't respond. Couldn't. His feet moved without asking, bringing him slowly into the room. He didn't sit. His eyes flickered over the children, then back to her. "I need to understand," he said finally. "All of it. Start from the beginning." Amara folded her arms across her chest and leaned against the chipped dresser. She exhaled slowly. "When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know how to tell you. I'd barely come to terms with it myself. I was scared, but I knew you would want to know. I was going to call you. Then your mother showed up." Nicholas flinched. "She came to my apartment," Amara continued. "2 days after I missed your call. I thought it was strange at first, but I didn't question it. She looked at me like I was a stray dog on her porch. She didn't sit, didn't ask if I was okay. She just said, 'This isn't happening.'" The air in the motel room thickened. "She told me you had moved on, that you regretted the engagement. She said you didn't want the child, that if I tried to contact you again, she would make sure I regretted it for the rest of my life." Nicholas's fists clenched at his sides. "She brought papers, legal threats, custody threats. She said her lawyers would make sure I lost everything. She knew where I worked. She knew I didn't have family. She knew everything. She lied to me," Nicholas said quietly, more to himself than to her. "She told me you left. No note, no message, nothing. Just gone." Amara's eyes glistened. "Because she made sure I had no way to reach you. I tried, Nicholas. I really did. I wrote letters. I called your office. But everything was intercepted. Eventually, I stopped. I couldn't fight her. And I thought, maybe it was true. Maybe you didn't want us." He looked at the boys again. One of them was humming to himself as he colored. A bright green dragon stretched across the page. "I would have wanted you," he said hoarsely. "All of you." Amara lowered her head. "I wanted to believe that, but I was 25, alone, pregnant, and your mother had the power of 10 lawyers and the resources to make my life disappear. I did what I thought was best." He didn't argue, couldn't, because as the pieces fell into place, he realized how easily it could have happened, how easily he had believed the worst of her, how quickly he had let silence settle between them. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then she moved toward the window and looked out at the cracked parking lot. "Why did you come yesterday?" "Because I saw your face," he said, "and I saw theirs. And everything else stopped." He stepped closer to the boys. "What are their names?" "Elijah," she said, nodding to the older by 3 minutes. "And Jalen." Nicholas knelt beside them slowly, his knees creaking. He wasn't sure what to say or how to sound, but the words came. "Hi," he said. I'm Nicholas." Elijah looked up. "Are you Mom's friend?" Amara turned from the window. Her voice was barely a whisper. "He's your father." Jalen looked up then, his crayon frozen in place. The two boys stared at him in unison, and for the first time Nicholas didn't see the confusion or the distance. He saw recognition, not in memory, but in something deeper. A mirror. He blinked hard, trying to contain the sting behind his eyes. "I didn't know," he said to them, his voice trembling. "I didn't know about you, but I'm here now, and I want to be here, if you'll let me." Elijah cocked his head. "Do you like dinosaurs?" Nicholas laughed, a real sound, cracked and unfamiliar. "I do. Big fan of T-Rex." Jalen cracked a smile. Behind them, Amara watched silently, her hands clasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. Later, when the boys fell asleep curled under one blanket, Nicholas and Amara sat in the two worn chairs beside the window. The city's buzz was muffled outside. Inside, it was quiet. "I don't know what to do next," he admitted. "I'm angry, not at you, at her, at myself, for not looking harder, for believing what she said." Amara sipped water from a plastic cup. "You don't have to decide everything now." He leaned forward. "I want to know them, be in their lives, not as a stranger with a name and money, but as their father." Her eyes searched his. "It won't be easy," he nodded. "Nothing worth it ever is." They didn't touch, didn't cry, but something shifted. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, not yet, but something real. A beginning. The morning after his visit to the motel, Nicholas awoke before dawn, the room still shadowed by early darkness. The fire in the hearth had gone cold. He sat upright in bed, elbows on his knees, hands pressed against his temples as though trying to keep his thoughts from shattering into 1,000 directions. The previous day's revelations had not dulled overnight. If anything, they had grown heavier, more solid, like wet cement filling the space between his ribs. He had children. Not hypothetically, not someday, now. 2 boys who had already lived nearly 8 years of life without knowing his name. And Amara had not abandoned him. She had been driven out like a trespasser from a house she once helped build. The woman he had loved, the life they could have had, it had all been stolen. But there was no time to linger in memory or fury. The reading of the will was scheduled for 9 o'clock sharp, and the attorneys had made it clear that attendance was not optional. There would be witnesses, stakeholders, board members, and with the scale of Eleanor Bryant's estate, an empire built across decades of calculated social power, every word read aloud could determine the fate of her fortune, and now, he realized, the future of the 2 boys she had denied. He dressed in silence, the ritual movements of tying his tie and buttoning his cuffs grounding him. By the time he descended the wide staircase of the estate, the staff had already set out silver coffee urns and platters of croissant and fruit, untouched by the mourners who sat stiffly in the drawing room awaiting the proceedings. The library had been converted into a makeshift courtroom. Heavy velvet curtains filtered the morning sun, casting long golden shadows across the spines of antique books. At the center sat a polished mahogany table, behind which the family attorney, Mr. Leonard Warren, was already arranging files and clearing his throat in quiet preparation. Nicholas entered, and all conversation ceased. The room was filled with familiar faces, some distant cousins, a few elder family friends, and several members of the Bryant Foundation's executive board. All watched him closely as he took his seat. "Mr. Bryant," Warren said with a courteous nod, "thank you for being punctual." Nicholas offered a polite, wordless nod. Once the last of the attendees settled into their high-backed chairs, Warren opened the central leather folio, adjusted his reading glasses, and began. As per the legally binding testament of Mrs. Eleanor D. Bryant, I will now proceed with the formal reading of her will. The contents herein are sealed and registered with the Fulton County Probate Court, witnessed and certified. The legal preliminaries were long and dry. Bequests to charities, trusts for longtime employees, endowments for museums and scholarship funds. But everyone in the room, Nicholas included, waited for the inevitable. The fate of the Bryant estate and its controlling interest in Bryant Heritage Holdings, one of the Southeast's most prestigious architectural preservation firms. Finally, Warren cleared his throat and turned the page. To my only son, Nicholas Daniel Bryant, he began, his voice steady but slow, I leave the primary residence known as the Bryant Manor, all its contents, and the surrounding estate lands. I also bequeath to him my personal investment portfolio and the controlling shares of Bryant Heritage Holdings under the following condition. There it was. Nicholas sat up straighter. Warren continued, pausing briefly as though gauging the room's reaction. That he shall, within 1 calendar year from the date of my passing, demonstrate the establishment of a stable and respectable family life, including, but not limited to, a domestic partnership or legal marriage to a partner deemed suitable for the preservation of the Bryant legacy and social standing. A long, stunned silence filled the room. Nicholas blinked. He looked around. No one else seemed surprised. Not the cousins, not the board members, only he was hearing this for the first time. Warren went on, not stopping to let the air settle. Should Mr. Bryant fail to satisfy this requirement by the conclusion of the stated period, all controlling shares in Bryant Heritage Holdings shall transfer to the Bryant Family Trust, to be administered by a board of trustees as named in the accompanying documents. The estate property shall be repurposed for philanthropic and public heritage uses under the guidance of the Bryant Foundation. Nicholas felt as though the room had shifted under his feet. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. A respectable family life, a suitable partner. The language was coded, but the meaning was crystal clear. This wasn't about legacy. This was about control, from beyond the grave. And now he understood why his mother had asked no questions when he stopped dating after the breakup with Amara. She had planned this. Not only the exclusion of Amara, but the enforcement of an image that suited her version of the Bryant name. He glanced around the room again. Alastair Morton, chairman of the Bryant Foundation and longtime rival of Nicholas's authority within the firm, was seated on the far end of the table. He did not smile, but there was something smug in the way his fingers tapped quietly on the armrest of his chair. There is one more matter, Warren said, flipping to the final pages. An addendum was filed approximately 6 months ago. Nicholas looked up sharply. An addendum? Warren nodded. Upon the possible discovery of biological offspring not previously acknowledged, the following clause applies. If such children are confirmed by paternity testing to be the progeny of Nicholas Daniel Bryant, a trust shall be established in their names, accessible at the age of 21. However, said children shall not be granted access to the family estate, nor be considered heirs in terms of Bryant Heritage Holdings. Nicholas stared at the page in front of him, though he saw nothing. His hands felt numb. So she knew. 6 months ago, that would have been around the time Amara told him she had tried to send another letter. Maybe it had reached someone. Maybe a photograph had fallen into the wrong hands. Or maybe Eleanor had always known. Maybe the threat was too real to ignore, 2 boys with Bryant blood, but not the Bryant image. And so she wrote them out with legal precision, a trust, without inheritance, without access. His children, Elijah and Jalen, had been made ghosts on paper, even as they lived and breathed just miles away. Further questions may be directed to my office, Warren concluded. This concludes the reading. But Nicholas didn't move. He couldn't. His mind raced, tumbling through memories, legal implications, and the reality he had woken into. He had thought the funeral would be an end. Instead, it was only the beginning of a fight for his sons, for his legacy, and perhaps for a future that no will could script. As the others began to leave, whispering amongst themselves, Alastair Morton paused near his chair and looked down at Nicholas. "You have some decisions to make, Nicholas," he said mildly, "and not a lot of time to make them." Nicholas looked up slowly. "Is that a threat?" "Of course not," Alastair replied too smoothly. "Just a reminder. The board is watching. The foundation is watching. You want to keep your seat, you'll need more than a pair of wide eyes and broken promises." He walked away. Nicholas remained in his chair long after the room had emptied, the papers in front of him a stack of inked betrayal. A respectable family, a suitable partner. She'd known. He stood slowly, gathered the documents, and left the library. Outside, the sky had begun to clear, pale blue breaking through gray. He reached for his phone and dialed. Amara answered on the second ring. "Can we meet?" he asked. "Today, I need to talk to you about everything." Her voice was quiet. "Where?" He looked across the estate's manicured gardens. "Here, at the house. Bring the boys." There was a long pause. "I'll come," she said. When the call ended, he stood still for a moment, letting the breeze touch his face. She had taken everything from him. His mother. The truth. The family he could have known. But this time he wasn't going to let the story be written without him. Amara arrived just before 3 in the afternoon, her car pulling slowly into the circular drive of the Bryant estate. Nicholas stood at the window of the upstairs study, watching the modest sedan approach against the backdrop of the mansion's grandeur. It looked impossibly small against the carved limestone and manicured hedges of the estate, but he was no longer seeing differences in scale. His attention was locked on the 2 small figures visible through the back windows, Elijah and Jalen, no longer strangers, though not yet sons in the full sense of the word. He descended the staircase as they stepped out of the car. The boys looked up at the house with wide eyes. Their small faces reflected a mix of awe and uncertainty. Amara stood close behind them, one hand resting gently on Elijah's shoulder. Nicholas opened the front door before they could knock. "Hi," he said quietly. Amara gave a small nod. The boys stared up at him, both holding back behind the hem of her coat. The entrance hall stretched out behind Nicholas, golden afternoon light slanting through the high windows. He stepped back. "Come in," he said. They entered slowly. The air inside was faintly scented with lemon and polish, the legacy of decades of staff maintaining the illusion of effortless elegance. The portraits of Bryant's past loomed silently from their frames, their painted eyes watching as the family they hadn't imagined stepped through the doors. Nicholas led them to the sunroom, the warmest place in the house. It had been his mother's favorite space for tea, for reading newspapers, for controlled laughter with carefully selected friends. Today, it was rearranged. Child-sized chairs brought in, a low table with juice boxes, fruit, and cookies arranged without flourish. It was the best he could think of. He was trying. The boys hesitated at first, but the sight of apple slices and chocolate chip cookies overcame their shyness. They sat side by side, eating silently but curiously, their eyes flicking to every corner of the ornate room. Nicholas sat across from them. "I thought maybe we could hang out here today, just us." Amara stood by the window, arms crossed. She had made it clear on the phone that she would stay, observe, let things unfold. But her posture radiated a quiet vigilance, the kind that comes from years of doing it all alone. Jalen looked up from his juice. "Is this your house?" Nicholas nodded. "It used to be my mom's. Now it's mine. But it's a big place for just one person." Elijah tilted his head. "Do you live here all by yourself?" "Mostly. Sometimes I have people come by for work." "Do you have toys?" Nicholas smiled despite himself. "Not many anymore, but I think we could fix that." The children exchanged glances, a silent communication Nicholas was already learning to recognize. A moment later, they resumed eating, their shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. Later, while the boys played with a borrowed chess set, turning the pieces into soldiers and spaceships, Nicholas and Amara stepped into the hallway. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. She nodded but didn't smile. "You said it was important." He hesitated, then handed her a folded packet of papers. "A will," he said. "She left everything to me, but with conditions. One of them is about you." Amara took the papers without opening them. Her expression didn't change. She seemed almost unsurprised. "She never forgave me," she said. "Even when I was gone, I guess I was still a problem." "She left a clause," he continued, "that I only get to keep the company and the estate if I marry someone suitable, her word, not just for love, but for image. She also acknowledged the boys. Sort of. They get a trust, but they're barred from ever inheriting part of the company." Amara's face hardened. "So, even in death, she wanted to erase us." Nicholas shook his head. "No, she couldn't. Not anymore. I'm not going to let her." Amara looked down the hall toward the sunroom. Elijah was pretending the rook was flying through space. Jalen was building a wall of pawns. She let out a slow breath. "You say that now, but it's a lot more complicated than words." "I know," he said, "but I'm not asking you to fix anything. I just want a chance. To know them. To be part of their lives." Amara studied him for a long moment. There was no easy forgiveness in her gaze, but there was something softer beneath the caution. A hint of belief. "I'm not going to stop you," she said finally. "They've already asked if they can come back." Over the next 2 weeks, they did. At first, for a few hours at a time. Afternoons in the garden, learning to ride scooters along the long driveway, games of hide-and-seek in the maze of back rooms. Nicholas joined them in everything. He canceled meetings, postponed presentations. For the first time in years, his calendar revolved around something other than profit. The boys remained cautious at first, but their questions grew bolder. They asked about his work, his favorite cartoons as a kid, whether he ever got scared at night in such a big house. He answered everything, honestly and with care. One rainy Sunday, while the storm beat gently against the windows, Elijah climbed onto the couch beside Nicholas and handed him a drawing. It was a picture of a tall man holding hands with 2 smiling boys. "That's you," Elijah said, "and that's us." Nicholas stared at the crayon lines, the uneven letters scrawled at the bottom. Dad. His chest tightened. He looked at Elijah, but the boy had already returned to his Legos, unaware of the seismic shift he had just caused in a man's heart. That evening, Amara lingered after picking them up. The boys had fallen asleep in the back seat, exhausted from an afternoon of board games and sugar. "You're good with them," she said quietly. He shrugged, but there was a faint grin tugging at his lips. "They're easy to love." She looked at him with something close to wonder. "You were always good at building things, but I didn't know you could build this." He hesitated, then took a small step closer. "I'm still learning, but I want to keep building it, with them." She nodded slowly, one day at a time. And so it began, an uneasy rhythm, a shared custody of moments rather than legal terms. They didn't talk about the past much. The words were too raw still. But the present was being written anew with every bedtime story, every laugh, every scraped knee that Nicholas helped bandage. It wasn't perfect. He forgot appointments, burned grilled cheese sandwiches, accidentally taught them a few bad words during a Falcons game. But they forgave him quickly, and he forgave himself even faster, which was new. Fatherhood, he was discovering, wasn't about knowing what to do. It was about showing up, again and again, without flinching. One morning, while the boys played outside with the gardener's dog, Nicholas and Amara sat on the back porch drinking coffee. The air smelled like magnolia and grass. "I've never had this before," he said, watching the children run. "What?" "A second chance." Amara looked at him, her gaze steady. "Don't waste it." He wouldn't. Not again. The first true warmth of spring arrived quietly, unfolding across the estate grounds like an old quilt being drawn over tired shoulders. The hydrangeas lining the back garden crept toward bloom. The white blossoms on the magnolia trees shook in the breeze like tissue in the hands of mourners. Nicholas found himself noticing the details again. The color of the sky at dusk, the sound of sneakers slapping brick, the hollow echo of laughter in hallways that had been silent for years. He found himself awake early, not out of restlessness, but out of purpose. Each morning, he waited for Amara's car to appear, and when it did, he met his sons at the gate with questions about their dreams, jokes he'd rehearsed, plans for the day. Slowly, the invisible wall that had separated him from Elijah and Jalen began to dissolve. They no longer paused before calling him Dad. They no longer looked to their mother for reassurance when he offered a hand or a promise. They accepted him as he came, flawed, clumsy, eager, and in that acceptance Nicholas felt something unspoken begin to mend inside himself. But even as the days with the boys grew richer, and the moments with Amara began to carry hints of the old, aching comfort they had once shared, something darker festered in the shadows of the Bryant house. It wasn't a physical presence, but a weight, a silence too thick to be natural. It was the lingering ghost of Eleanor, and the growing need Nicholas felt to understand the full extent of what she had done. He could not allow himself to move forward completely until he knew, beyond doubt, how deeply she had reached into his life, how far she had gone to preserve her version of legacy. It was on a quiet Tuesday, after Elijah had gone down for a nap and Jalen was occupied with a book in the study, that Nicholas climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The staff had long avoided the space, too dusty, too cluttered with old trunks and broken furniture. But Nicholas remembered the attic from his childhood. It had once felt like a castle of forgotten treasures, a place of hiding and imagination. Now it loomed like a sealed vault waiting to be unlocked. He pushed open the door, coughing as dust spiraled into the air. The single window at the far end cast a hazy cone of light across the stacked crates and covered chairs. He moved slowly, stepping over a rusted globe, past an old rocking horse, until he came to a trunk bearing the Bryant crest. It was heavy. The hinges protested, but after a moment of effort, it creaked open. Inside, beneath layers of yellowed lace and brittle photo albums, was a bundle of letters bound by faded blue ribbon. Beneath that, a velvet journal, the kind Eleanor had once used for everything from event planning to grocery lists. Nicholas lifted it with reverence and unease. He sat on an old bench, wiped the dust from the cover, and opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably his mother's. Neat, deliberate, unforgiving. The entries dated back decades, but it wasn't long before he found what he had come for. April 11th, Nicholas is seeing that girl again, the one from his university, Amara, sweet smile, clever eyes, but wrong, so very wrong. He doesn't see it now, but he will. He must. He flipped to the next. June 2nd. They are engaged. He told me today with a face like victory. I told him nothing. What could I say? That I would burn it all before letting my family name be diluted? No. I smiled, and I began. Nicholas turned the pages, faster now, his breath quickening. July 19th. Contacted Mr. Dobson at Fairchild Legal. If she doesn't walk away on her own, there are other ways. Pressure, persuasion. She has no family, no savings. She's one hard push from vanishing. August 3rd, she left. I arranged it quietly. The lawyer delivered the agreement. She didn't even try to fight. I almost feel sorry for her. Almost. His hands trembled as he turned the last entry. January 12th. 6 years since the child was born. Yes, I know. I've kept the information private. I monitor from a distance. I gave her more than she asked for in the end. I made sure the boys had something, but not enough to claim anything real. Nicholas must never know. He's too soft. He would forgive. Nicholas stared at the pages, the words carved into his mother's ink with surgical detachment. She had known about the pregnancy, about the birth. She had planned the silence, orchestrated the disappearance, and ensured that any reconciliation would be nearly impossible. And yet, she had left breadcrumbs, the trust, the conditional inheritance. She had tried to have it both ways, exclusion and control, punishment and provision, and in the end, it had cost her everything. A family fractured, a son who would never see her as anything but a stranger behind a veil of strategy. He found a sealed envelope near the bottom of the trunk, his name written in Eleanor's careful hand. He opened it slowly. My dearest Nicholas, if you are reading this, then you have gone looking, and that means I failed to protect you from the pain I foresaw. I did what I did out of love, a kind of love you may never understand. But I believed with all my heart that you were meant for more than what that life with her could offer. You were meant to lead, to preserve what your father and I built, and I feared she would tear that down. Yes, I separated you. Yes, I lied. I won't ask forgiveness, but I will ask that you remember this. Legacy matters. Blood matters. And if you are now a father, I pray you will teach your children strength, not softness. I loved you in my own way. I always did. Mother. The letter slipped from his hands and landed on the floor beside the journal. Nicholas sat in silence, his chest hollow, his eyes dry. Later that night, he sat with Amara on the back porch. The boys had fallen asleep upstairs. The stars stretched wide above them, unmarred by city light. Amara listened as he told her everything. The journal, the letter, the years of manipulation. She didn't cry. She didn't speak for a long time. I always knew it was her, she said finally, but it still hurts to hear it laid out so clearly. She thought I was nothing, that I didn't deserve to be part of your world. She was wrong, he said, about you, about everything. Amara looked at him with a quiet sadness. And you? What do you want now? "I want them," he said. "Our boys, a life with them, and maybe, someday, with you. But first, I need to make this right." She looked out at the garden. "Then start there." That night, Nicholas didn't sleep. He walked the halls of the house, past oil portraits and marble busts, past the relics of old wealth and old power. And as he did, he saw not what had been taken, but what might still be made. Not inherited, created. The morning after Nicholas showed Amara the journal and the letter, the house felt different. Lighter, somehow, though the air was still weighted with everything that had been unearthed. The walls of the estate no longer echoed with silence, but held the whispers of boys' laughter and the rhythmic hum of a life beginning to be rebuilt. Still, beneath that new rhythm, Nicholas felt the ticking of something else, an invisible clock counting down the months, the weeks, the days. 1 year, his mother had written. A year to prove he was capable of sustaining the kind of family life she had dictated. A year to marry someone of her approval or forfeit control over the company, the estate, and the legacy she had jealously guarded. And now, halfway into that year, the pressure was mounting. He could feel it from the board of directors, especially Alastair Morton, who had grown bolder in his communications, often veiled in formality but never without threat. There were murmurs of instability, of ethical review, of preparing contingencies for leadership transition. Investors were restless, stakeholders uneasy. The media had caught scent of the drama, and while most of it was speculative fluff, the headlines still drew attention. Architect heir faces inheritance ultimatum, and Bryant legacy hangs in the balance. Nicholas tried to ignore them. He focused on the boys, on Amara, on repairing the broken lattice of a future once stolen. He took the twins to school in the mornings, learned which one preferred apples over grapes in their lunch boxes, read up on science fiction when Elijah mentioned an interest in planets, and bought a set of watercolor brushes when Jalen said he wanted to paint clouds that look like dogs. Every evening, he was there to answer questions, settle arguments, brush teeth, and dim nightlights. Each ordinary act felt monumental, and each day it became harder to imagine giving that up. Not for business, not for anything. He had thought often of what Amara had said, start there, and he had. But it wasn't enough. Not with a company hanging in limbo, not with men like Alistair circling the perimeter of his authority like sharks. Something had to be done. A line drawn. A public move. He spent several sleepless nights drafting a plan that would honor both his conscience and his responsibilities. On the 5th night, he met with a lawyer from outside the Bryant network, someone who had no allegiance to the board or the family legacy. They discussed options, legal restructuring, limited power of attorney, charitable trusts, and then Nicholas made a decision. He called a press conference. It was scheduled for a Monday morning in a glass atrium at the center of Bryant Heritage Tower. Reporters gathered, cameras were set, and behind the podium stood a banner that read, not Bryant Heritage, but something new. The Elijah and Jalen Foundation. Beneath it, the words, Legacy Reimagined. Nicholas stood at the podium, dressed in a simple navy suit, no tie, sleeves rolled to the elbows. Behind him stood Amara and the boys, not as a prop, but as presence, their existence no longer hidden. "Good morning," he began, his voice even and clear. "For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nicholas Bryant, son of the late Eleanor Bryant, architect, father, and today someone choosing a future over a past." He paused. For generations, the Bryant name has stood for tradition, legacy, and discipline. But names, like buildings, must be renovated if they are to remain relevant. You can preserve heritage without sacrificing humanity, and that's what I'm here to do. He outlined his decision to transfer 35% of his voting shares in Bryant Heritage Holdings into a new philanthropic foundation named after his sons. The foundation would support education and housing initiatives for children raised by single parents, especially those marginalized by social or economic injustice. I've been given great privilege, he said, and I've also inherited pain. I can't rewrite the past, but I can build from it. I can choose not to let silence win. I can choose to raise my sons with truth. When he finished, the room was silent for a breath, then erupted into questions. He answered what he could. He didn't say whether he planned to marry, whether he intended to remain CEO past the year's end, or what exactly the rest of the will stipulated. He only said, "I'm focused on my family. The rest will fall into place." Afterward, they returned to the estate. Nicholas let the boys run ahead, their shouts echoing through the garden like wind chimes. Amara stayed behind, walking beside him in the gravel path beneath the canopy of oaks. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I did," he replied, "for them, for you, for me. I can't change what my mother did, but I don't have to honor her choices by repeating them." She looked at him, her eyes unreadable. "You still have 5 months left. Do you know what you're going to do about the rest of it?" He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "I know what I want. I want to raise my sons in a house where their names aren't whispered in shame. I want to love them freely. I want you to feel safe here, not like a guest, not like someone passing through." "And us?" she asked, voice soft. He hesitated, the air around them holding its breath. "I don't want to ask you to marry me just to meet some clause in a will, but I also don't want to pretend that what we had, what we might still have, doesn't matter. I'm not the same man I was, but I still love you, Amara. I never stopped. I just forgot how to remember you without the pain." Her eyes glistened, but she did not look away. "I never stopped loving you either, but I've built walls you might not even see yet, and I have to protect myself, protect them. I'm not asking for yes or no. I'm asking for time, for a chance to show you I can be more than the man who believed my mother instead of you." She nodded slowly. "Then let's keep walking." And so they did. In the weeks that followed, life settled into something closer to ordinary. The boys returned to their routines with a new ease, bringing home drawings and stories, asking questions that spilled into dinner and bath time and bed. Amara began volunteering with one of the foundation's new community programs, coordinating workshops for women in transitional housing. Nicholas reorganized the firm's internal culture board and restructured several top positions to reflect a broader, more inclusive leadership. They were small steps, but they were real. And every evening, when the lights dimmed and the house quieted, Nicholas sat with his sons, sometimes reading, sometimes listening, sometimes simply holding their hands as they fell asleep, and he felt, in the marrow of his bones, that he had found something no inheritance could buy: a reason, a home, a truth he could finally build on. The summer faded slowly into fall, each day surrendering another sliver of heat, another hour of light. The air turned crisp, carrying the scent of pine and cooling soil, and the sprawling grounds of the Bryant estate shifted in hue: gold, rust, and burnished copper, spreading across the manicured lawns and hedges like a blessing of change. The twin boys had discovered the joy of raking leaves only to jump into them moments later, laughing with abandon as the crisp piles scattered beneath their bodies. Nicholas watched them from the veranda most afternoons, his mug cooling in his hands, heart full in ways that no title or inheritance could replicate. He had almost forgotten how it felt to exist without armor. Amara had begun to come more often. At first, it was under the pretext of checking in on the boys after school, of helping them with homework, of ensuring their routine was respected. But it became something more. She started staying through dinner, lingering at the table after the dishes were cleared, her fingers tracing circles on the linen tablecloth while Nicholas read aloud from whichever book the twins had chosen that night. Sometimes she stayed while the boys drifted off to sleep, and they would talk in low tones on the back porch about things they'd missed, about where they had been in the lost years, and about where they were going now. The mansion had changed too. What once felt like a monument to control now began to soften at the edges. Elijah's drawings of rocket ships and planets decorated the walls of the upstairs hallway, framed in inexpensive wooden frames Nicholas had picked out himself. Jalen's watercolors, abstract moody pieces that Amara said reminded her of her early work, hung in the sunroom. A corner of the kitchen had been designated for school projects and the boys' lunch boxes. Even the staff, once stiff and silent in their presence, had begun to relax, exchanging smiles with Amara and slipping extra cookies into the boys' backpacks. Despite the warmth that had taken root within the estate's walls, the outside world remained less forgiving. The Bryant Foundation Board continued to monitor Nicholas closely, holding scheduled quarterly meetings that always ended in uneasy half-smiles and veiled questions. Though none of them dared challenge his position outright, their expectations were clear. The deadline approached. The clause remained. The decision had not yet been made. Would Nicholas Bryant marry? Would he satisfy the condition of stability and respectability, or would the firm, the estate, and everything else his family had built revert to the carefully constructed hands of the trustees? The pressure hung in the background, quiet but insistent, like the ticking of a clock heard in the next room. Nicholas tried not to let it taint the life he was building, but he knew the deadline loomed. And so, one Sunday afternoon, as golden light filtered through the tall windows of the family sitting room, Nicholas sat Amara down across from him. The boys were outside with a tutor, gathering leaves for a school project. The house was still. "I've been thinking," he began. "A lot." Amara said nothing, only folded her hands in her lap and waited. "I'm not going to ask you to marry me," he said, watching her eyes flicker, "unless it's something we both want. Not for my mother, not for the will, not for any of that. Only if it's because we found our way back to something that matters." "I'm glad," she said softly, "because I don't want to be someone's solution to a legal problem." He nodded. "I know, but I also know this. What we've built here, the way the boys light up when you walk in the room, the way they trust me now, the way you've begun to trust me again, that's not a strategy, that's not about a will. It's a life. And I want it to last." Amara looked at him for a long time. "I don't know if I'll ever stop fearing that it'll all be taken away again," she said. "I spent years waiting for the other shoe to drop. When you're raising children alone, you don't get to believe in fairy tales." "I don't want a fairy tale," he said. "I want a family." They didn't decide anything that day. There was no grand proposal, no sudden declaration. But when she reached across the table and took his hand, it felt more binding than any vow. October brought new rituals. School drop-offs with warm drinks in the car, Saturday soccer games, quiet evenings watching old movies. Elijah became obsessed with constellations, often waking Nicholas in the middle of the night to point out Orion through the window. Jalen announced that he wanted to be a color professor when he grew up, and no one corrected him. Amara's visits became stays, first overnight, then several nights a week. Her toothbrush appeared in the upstairs bathroom. Her books found their way to the bedside table. And one day, without ceremony, she began calling the house home. As the weeks rolled forward, the boys adjusted in ways that only children can, fluid, trusting, endlessly resilient. They stopped asking questions about the past, content instead to live in the now. On a chilly November afternoon, as Nicholas helped them hang construction paper turkeys on the kitchen cabinets, Elijah tugged on his sleeve and asked, "Are you and Mommy going to get married?" Nicholas paused, one hand still holding a glue stick. "Would you like that?" he asked. Elijah shrugged. "It already feels like we are." Jalen nodded sagely. "You already live in the same house, you just sleep in different rooms." Nicholas smiled and ruffled their hair, blinking hard to chase away the sting behind his eyes. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Together." December arrived with snow that dusted the tops of the hedges and frosted the manor's windows. The fireplace burned nightly, and the house glowed with a warmth that no electricity could mimic. The boys helped decorate the tree, hanging mismatched ornaments beside the antique ones passed down through generations. They wrote letters to Santa and addressed one to their father, too. "Thank you for finding us." Nicholas kept that letter in the top drawer of his desk, folded between the pages of his mother's final note. On Christmas Eve, as the family sat around the dinner table, just the four of them, no extended relatives, no board members, no expectations, Nicholas stood and tapped his glass. "I know we didn't make a big deal out of gifts this year," he said, "but I do have one thing to give." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Amara froze, her breath catching in her throat. "I'm not doing this because of a contract," he said. "Not because of inheritance, not because of pressure. I'm doing it because I love you, because I never stopped, and because I want to spend the rest of my life raising our sons and growing old with you. I want to build something that no will can tear apart." He opened the box. Inside, a ring, not the original, but something new, simpler, wiser. Amara didn't cry. She smiled, the kind of smile that took years to build. Then she whispered, "Yes." The boys cheered. Jalen nearly knocked over his glass. Elijah patted Nicholas's arm solemnly and said, "Told you so." They married quietly the following spring. No press, no extravagance, just vows in the back garden, under the magnolia tree, with the boys standing beside them holding the rings. The only guests were a few close friends, some neighbors, and staff who had become something more. In the final meeting with the board, Nicholas presented the marriage certificate without flourish. Alistair Morton raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The control remained in Nicholas's hands. But more importantly, the legacy had shifted. Bryant Heritage Holdings expanded that year, taking on community restoration projects in underserved neighborhoods. The Elijah and Jalen Foundation funded its first early education center. And back at the estate, the walls were no longer lined with portraits of silent ancestors, but with the laughter, love, and chaos of a family that had found its way back to one another. Nicholas no longer feared the ticking clock. It had struck midnight, then morning, then afternoon, and still the life he had feared he'd lost was here, fuller than he'd imagined. In the end, it wasn't legacy that saved them. It was choice, and love, and the courage to say, "This time we stay." If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure to check out the next one. You won't want to miss what's coming next.